The Great War still raged. Armies had mobilized, fought, and settled into trench warfare. With the Western Front now in a stalemate, both sides would attempt to open new fronts, introduce new weapons, and turn this European war into a global one. In the opening stages of the war, battles featured complicated infantry and cavalry maneuvers, and lines were always moving. Yet after the race to the sea and the Battle of Ypres, trench warfare became the norm in France and Belgium. Plus, machine guns and heavy artillery made cavalry obsolete. Both sides would also use vast amounts of barbed wire to funnel enemy troops into kill zones. 1915 would also see the introduction of snipers into warfare. Now, even poking your head above the parapet was a risk. The trench systems themselves would also get an upgrade. While at first, they were shallow ditches in the ground, trenches would now be divided into 3 sectors. First, the frontline trench. This was the most dangerous and closest to the enemy. There were also smaller trenches going out into no man's land, connecting to listening posts. Next was the support trench. This is where most troops were housed and, if need be, deployed. Finally, the reserve trench. This is where many logistical offices such as field kitchens and hospitals were located. Artillery was also housed in this sector. However, the Russian front never really developed trench warfare. The terrain in the east was much more open, and the sheer size of the front meant that the majority of German troops would have to be stationed there in order to man static defenses. Although, less men and a wider front meant better conditions for cavalry, and it would be used until the end of the war. The Belgian Armored Car Division would also fight in Russia after 1914. With trench warfare in full swing, the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary recruited the Ottoman Empire in October of 1914. Although, other than suffering a defeat to the Russians in the Caucasus, nothing of note really happened. They would also receive the German warships Goeben and Breslau, which were on the run from the Royal Navy. The beginning of 1915 saw the Germans bringing the war to the British Isles. On January 19th, they launched the first Zeppelin raid over England, killing 4 and causing a substantial amount of damage. The German Navy would also begin its unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. Any ships in the British waters would be considered a viable target. With the winter weather clearing up, the German army prepared for its next big offensive. The target, Ypres, which had seen brutal fighting the year prior. If successful in taking Ypres, it may even restart the War of Movement. In order to make such a breakthrough, almost 6,000 canisters of poisonous chlorine gas were brought to the front lines. On April 22nd, they opened the canisters, and the gas floated towards the Allied lines. The 4-mile-wide cloud of gas reached the French Colonial 45th and 87th Division at 5 p.m. They suffered 2,000 to 3,000 casualties and fled, as they didn't know how to protect themselves from the gas. The Germans advanced behind the retreating French forces, although they suffered almost no gas-related casualties, as they were wearing cloth masks soaked in protective solutions. The German army could have occupied Ypres if they wished, but dug in after capturing the villages of Langemarck and Pekin. Fortunately for the Allies, Canadian troops were able to figure out how to protect themselves from the gas by using urine-soaked fabric. With the gap in the Allied lines still open, more Canadian units were brought in to plug it. The fighting was desperate. In one unit, the 16th Canadian Scottish Battalion of the 3rd Brigade suffered 75% casualties while attacking German positions. The Second Battle of Ypres would rage on until late May. The German army never captured Ypres itself. They were able to push the British army back by 3 miles, at the cost of 35,000 dead. With the Russian front becoming unstable, the First Lord of the Admiralty and future Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, proposed a plan to end the war and link Britain and France with Russia. The quickest route to the Russian Empire was through the Dardanelles Straits and past the Ottoman capital of Istanbul. After weeks of preparation and naval bombardments, the Allies landed troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula on April 25th. With Anzac divisions landing in multiple places, British High Command expected a quick victory. Yet the Ottomans were fighting on their home turf, and the Allies were once again forced to dig in. Churchill resigned his position and joined the regular army as an officer. Fighting would rage on in Gallipoli until January 1916. May would also see another power join the war. Italy, which had recently been neutral, joined World War I on May 23rd, on the side of Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia. Italy had ties with both Germany and Austria. They had even been allied with them at one point. Although, the promise of Austrian territory, with groups of ethnic Italians living there, won them over. The Germans would also sink the ocean liner Lusitania on May 5th, which was carrying 159 Americans, 123 of whom would drown. This infuriated the American government. Germany agreed to end its unrestricted submarine warfare and be more careful when choosing targets. The Italian army would see its first major action on June 23rd at the Isonzo River. Their goal was to secure the surrounding mountaintops that Austro-Hungarian troops were dug in on. Despite the 2-to-1 advantage the Italians had, the Austrians were dug in on literal mountains, so it was hard to make progress. The Italian army also faced several logistical issues. There was a shortage of artillery ammunition, rifles, and they had 0 hand grenades of any kind. The Isonzo would see constant action for the rest of the war. So far, the air war was a dangerous and primitive one. Both sides wanted to shoot down the enemy reconnaissance planes, but shooting through your propeller risked a crash. One Russian pilot rammed his plane into an Austrian one, although that ended in both pilots' deaths. One French pilot installed armor plates on the back of his propeller blades. Some even resorted to putting their gunners in front of the prop, which was extremely dangerous while in combat. One Dutch inventor by the name of Anthony Fokker was able to create the interrupter gear. This synchronized the firing of the machine gun and the rotation of the propeller. All pilots had to do was point their nose at the enemy and shoot. These were installed on German single-seater reconnaissance planes. By June of 1915, they had been deployed, and these primitive fighter planes were feared by the Allies. By January 1916, the British Royal Flying Corps had lost 120 airplanes in this Fokker scourge. German aces such as Oswald Bulka or Max Immelmann became some of the first pioneers of air combat. By the end of his career, Bulka would have 40 air-to-air kills. He would also write down some of the most important rules for air-to-air combat in the Dicta Bulka. 1. Try to secure advantages before attacking. If possible, keep the sun behind you. 2. Always carry through an attack if you have started it. 3. Fire only at close range, and only when your opponent is squarely in your sights. 4. Always keep your eye on your opponent, and never let yourself be deceived by ruses. 5. In any form of attack, it is essential to assault your opponent from behind. 6. If your opponent dives on you, do not try to evade his onslaught, but fly to meet it. 7. When over enemy lines, never forget your line of retreat. 8. For the squadron, attack on principle in groups of 6. When the fight breaks up into a series of single combats, take care that several do not go for the same opponent. Over in the Eastern Front, the Russians hadn't had any luck. The Austro-Hungarian and German armies had launched a campaign into Poland in mid-spring, pushing them back. By August 5th, they had captured Warsaw. In response to this string of recent failures, the Russian Emperor Tsar Nicholas II took personal command of the armed forces. Despite this, the Russian military would continue to see disappointing defeats, and nothing of note happened in Russia for the rest of the year. The British Army would attempt to mimic the German surprise attack seen at Ypres in April. The plan was to release 140 tons of gas and then advance. Hopefully, the Germans would be weakened and casualties among British ranks would be low. Royal Engineer tunneling companies would also dig under no man's land and lay mines, ready to detonate them when the British went over the top. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned for the British High Command. When the gas was deployed on September 25th, the wind quickly changed direction, blowing the poisonous gas back towards their own lines. The Germans were also well dug in and had the artillery advantage. In many places, British troops didn't even reach their objectives. In the first 3 days, 50,000 English, Scottish, Irish, and Canadian troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The Battle of Loos would end in mid-October. The deadlock would continue. Once again, fighting died down, and winter arrived. 1916 would soon be here.